With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. Thank you so much for being with us here on the program on this Monday, and with everything that's going on in the world, we know that, typically this is the part of the intro, and if you've been listening to my show, you know this, that I thank the audience for taking time out of their busy day to listen to us, and I still do appreciate that, but at the same time, you probably have a little more free time than you normally do. But either way, we appreciate you being with us, whether you had to squeeze us in because of your tight schedule or because, well, you've got nothing better to do, which is pretty much the majority of my audience. I feel like it's sometimes like, well, Caleb's on, I guess I'll watch him. There's nothing else good on. But anyway, we're glad to have you with us nonetheless, and we've got a lot going on. As always, we're going to start with our Alabama coronavirus update. So this is actually a new thing that has just been put up by the Alabama Department of Public Health. So you've seen that we've been putting up the pictures of the graphics that give you a breakdown of each county. It's basically an Excel spreadsheet that they have on their website. They have this really cool new dashboard that helps you keep track of it. So I do want to give props to the Alabama Department of Public Health for putting this together, and this is the latest. You'll see that it actually gives you a map of the counties and where the hot zones in the state of Alabama are, which I find very helpful. So you can see it up there. It also gives you the total confirmed cases, the total tested, which is a new feature, and also dead from the illness, which luckily remains at 0, and we hope, of course, that it stays there. So you can see there on that map, you can see really where all the hot zones are. There's a lot of them in Lee, a lot of them in Shelby and Jefferson, which would be closer to the Birmingham area. You can see a few up in the northern part of the state. And of course, Madison County would be where an awful lot of people drive from Huntsville. So you're noticing there on that map that the vast majority of the cases are taking place in population centers, which makes sense for two reasons. Regardless of how this thing spread, of course there would be more confirmed cases in population centers because, well, there's more people. And if there's more people, then there's a higher likelihood, even if this were dispersed at random, just you randomly got coronavirus without having to come in contact with anybody, that would be expected. But especially considering this is an infectious disease, of course, people that are in closer quarters are going to run into each other more. And if you're a more densely populated area, that's going to be expected that you are more likely to spread the virus around that way, but also because there are just more people, you're going to have more people to get tested and more people to get confirmed with that. So obviously you're seeing there in the most densely populated areas of the state, you've got the 4 largest cities. Montgomery still has a relatively low amount of cases. Elmore actually has a few more than us. Now, that could be attributed to a number of different factors. Maybe people in Montgomery County aren't getting tested as much, but I appreciate that they've included the test by how many have been tested, and that gives us a pretty good indication of how many people that are getting tested are actually being confirmed. We can look at that as a percentage. So if you're looking at, we have 196 confirmed cases, which of course is nothing to sneeze at, pardon the pun. But you have 196 confirmed cases, which is a plus 118 since Thursday, the last time that we did a show. That's really not as bad as I thought it was going to be. Because if you'll remember, what we've been talking about the past week here on the show is that we were going to hit a point, just like everywhere else that has had the coronavirus, where you're going to see increase, and then you'll see normal increases for a few days. And then what you're going to see is a sharp spike, and you're going to see that go up dramatically in a small amount of time, and that's called the exponential spike. Now, what actually happened was not that, which is surprising because I was talking about how originally we had plus 10 from Monday to Tuesday, plus 12 from Tuesday to Wednesday, and then Wednesday to Thursday we had almost 30 new cases, which I said was an indication of an exponential spike. But if you're looking at 118 new cases since Thursday, that only measures out to about 30 new cases a day if you average it over the past 4 days. And that means the exponential spike is probably still coming, but it does show some indication that maybe some of the measures that have been taken have actually had an effect at flattening the curve. Because remember, before this happened, we were at a plus 27 new cases a day rate from Wednesday to Thursday, and now it's leveled off at roughly 30, 31-ish. That's pretty good. And I'm not saying that means that exponential spike isn't going to come at all, or that we're not going to get hit by this pretty hard, because data from other countries that have dealt with this have shown that is going to come. But it looks like we've actually done something to considerably flatten that spike, at least so far. So good job, everybody. Let's keep it up. Now, some news compared to the rest of the country, because I want to give us an idea, to give us some context of how the state is doing. There were 100 coronavirus deaths in the United States today only, which brings the national total to 500. So the fact that none of those have occurred in the state of Alabama, especially considering some of the things that put us personally at higher risk than other states, for instance, we have an older population in many respects, that kind of thing. Not having any deaths in Alabama is actually something to be somewhat optimistic about. So the total number of tested, which of course is 1,832, and by that math, that means we have about 11% of the people that have been tested in the state of Alabama have been shown to have it. Hopefully that means that this whole thing is kind of working, and we are doing some things that actually have staved off at least the worst part of the coronavirus, at least for the time being. So I don't want to oversell it. I don't want to make it sound like, hey, we're out of the woods and we don't have to worry about it anymore. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that the measures we've taken at least seem to have had some effect. And that is a very positive thing. Now, no matter the outcome of this, unfortunately, it's going to be criticized by people that are kind of looking for something to be upset about. And granted, I'm not saying that there's not a lot to be upset about the way that this whole thing was handled. I'm not even saying that I'm not going to be one of them. I'm just saying that one thing I do want us to be careful about is to fall into the trap of being naysayers regardless of what the outcome is, because what's going to happen is if this thing blows over and it turns out to not be a big deal, and that's largely because of the response that we had to it, what you're going to see in reaction to that is, oh, that coronavirus thing, that wasn't so bad. I don't know why they went through all these drastic measures. Well, the drastic measures may have been what actually helped make it not so bad. And then you'll have people in the reverse, if this thing turns out to be a nightmare, saying, well, why wasn't the response sooner? Why wasn't the response more drastic? And so that's the problem. Partisan politics aside, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, regardless, that's one thing that the government response, it will be easy to respond to whichever party happens to be controlling either a state government or the federal government in that way. And so that's one thing that I think we have to be really careful about and try to be objective when observing these things. Because what I'm most concerned about is not the political fallout here. What I'm most concerned about is one of those attitudes, regardless of which one is prevalent, whether it winds up not being as big a deal and a whole bunch of people are saying, we just way overblew it, and so let's just ignore it for the time being. By the way, quick update on a story that we did Thursday. You remember that was essentially the attitude of a whole bunch of the college students that went down to Miami to do spring break, regardless of the fact that Corona was going around. And when they were down there, they were being interviewed by CBS News, and they were saying, it's all overblown. It's not a big deal. It's not going to stop us from having a good time. Well, it turns out an awful lot of those students tested positive for the Wuhan flu. So, yeah, the award for most predictable end to a news story ever goes to... But anyway, so that's just kind of an example of that. And what I'm worried about is people that have that attitude will have the same attitude the next time this comes around, if it does indeed come around a second time, for example, in the fall or something like that. And they say, no, we don't need to take any protective measures because what happened last time is it wound up being a big bust and we did all that for nothing. And then you'll have people on the opposite end of the spectrum. If this winds up being a huge nightmare, you'll have them, maybe... Well, the thing is, I don't expect it to become a big nightmare, but if it does, you'll have people maybe trying to overreact and even go to the point to where we're actually eroding our liberties, which I think we've actually already passed that threshold, but eroding our liberties in response to it the second time around. So either way, this is going to be a problem, and I want you all to remember, because history is a fantastic teacher, that when we're talking about the regular old flu, that year 2 was significantly worse than year 1. Year 1 was pretty bad, year 2 was way worse in the United States. Now, granted, that was almost 100 years ago, but the point is, the way that we responded to it, I'm afraid that we'll have a similar issue coming up with that one, because you'll have those attitudes that I just discussed with you, and that would be a real problem, that we wind up making the second year worse than the first, because instead of learning from year 1, we kind of scoff at what happened, regardless of whatever the results may be. So here is some good news in regards to all of that. Alabama might hit 90 degrees this week. Now, I know that for those of you who know me personally or have listened to the show intently for a long time are like, Caleb is announcing that warm weather is a good thing. There must be some kind of catch. Well, as I discussed Thursday, there is a study that shows that heat and humidity actually does curtail the spread of coronavirus. Now, it's not conclusive because of how new this science is. We haven't had much time to observe the coronavirus, and as such, any studies that are done have to be taken with a grain of salt, and I explained all that on Friday. But if it is true, and the results do seem to suggest that, also some data that we have for some nations near the equator where it stays hot pretty much year-round that haven't really had issues with the Wuhan flu much, well, if that is the case, then Alabama hitting 90 degrees may be really, really good for bringing this pandemic to a halt. The National Weather Service is predicting that anywhere from 10 to 15 degrees warmer than average, which could get us up to 90 degrees in some of our southern counties, specifically in the Mobile area, the not quite as far north as Dothan, but just below Dothan, sort of in South Alabama, Geneva, Slocum, that kind of area, could see 90-degree temperatures, which may very well go a very long way in helping prevent the spread of coronavirus. So let's go ahead and look at this. This is going to show some record temperatures for March the 27th, which of course is coming up, which is expected to be the hottest day in this weather cycle that the National Weather Service is predicting. And I want you to look at some of the records that may very well be beaten on March the 27th, coming up in just 4 days from now. So let's go ahead and look at that. This is provided by AL.com. So you'll see Anniston, Birmingham, Huntsville, Mobile, Montgomery, Muscle Shoals. Montgomery, of course, where we are right now, 89 degrees, our record high for that day in 1910. One thing I notice about this, too, if you look at those numbers, there's an awful lot of early 1900s days setting the record here. You remember that big snap of global warming that we had in the early 1900s? Apparently, that's what's going on there, which, I mean, yes, that is it doesn't by any means completely destroy the global warming narrative, but it's a pretty significant example of how that science is far from conclusive when it comes to that a lot of our hottest days on this particular time of the year have not been broken in about 110 years now. Maybe broken this week, we don't know. But the point is, if it were really continuously getting hotter and we were in a warming trend that has been continuing ever since then. You would think at some point the last 110 years we would have, I don't know, broken that record somewhere along the way, but apparently not. Anyway, just thought that was interesting, and I just thought I'd add that in there. But the point is, if the predictions are true, there's a very good chance that for once in the state of Alabama, the fact that we have summer starting in mid-March and lasting until, about the week after Halloween could be a very good thing for the state of Alabama for once in our lives. The fact that our temperatures are just ridiculous and we have 100% humidity all the time might actually make us more or less immune to the spread of coronavirus. And who knows, the warmer temperatures over the weekend, that may be the reason that we saw that exponential spike not take place. I'm not saying that it is conclusively, because I don't know. But I'm saying maybe it was a contributing factor. And if so, for once it's really nice to be in a really hot, humid climate. I actually saw somebody react to the story that I posted last week that was talking about this study. And someone reacted to it. Some dude just playing a guitar singing Sweet Home Alabama, which, I feel is appropriate. Being in Alabama might be a huge advantage in this fight. So we might actually be spared the brunt of all this because of our climate, but that could be very different if this thing returns in a year, because we've been pretty fortunate that this thing didn't really hit the States until about 3 weeks ago. And the fact that it just spread to Alabama realistically probably about 2 weeks ago. I know that we didn't have our first confirmed case until about a week ago today, but let's be honest, and I said this back at the time, we probably did have cases of corona before then. But if the Wu flu happens to, die out because of our climate, that's not something that we can rely on if it's already established and already moving around, say, in November around the rest of the world. Because if that happens, then we're in for, 3 or 4 good months where this thing could really hit us hard next year. And I'm just wanting us to be prepared for that just because it caught us on the tail end of flu season this year doesn't mean that it can't catch us at the beginning next year and really throw us for a loop. So let's keep that in mind. Some national news on this, because I don't know if I should cover this as just the first shoe that falls, because I get the feeling that it is. I see on the horizon, as it were, that we're going to have a lot of lawmakers, senators, members of the House, arguably, maybe even the president, and I would not be surprised if President Trump does come down with corona. I hope that he doesn't, but it's very well possible that he does. But the first major lawmaker in D.C. has gotten the COVID-19 virus. Rand Paul has come down with the Wuhan Flu, and he is the first senator to test positive for the Kung Flu. So he's okay, and based on a press release that came out from his office earlier today, so far he is not symptomatic. So he just happened to get a test, and the test showed that he is indeed somebody that is carrying that virus. So no symptoms yet, but he is a carrier, and that means he'll probably experience symptoms in the next day or two. Now, I want you to remember as well, and this is why I'm asking you to pray for him and pray for the Paul family as a whole, that Rand had lung damage when he was assaulted in 2017. So you remember that incident where he was just mowing his grass on his riding lawnmower and a crazy liberal activist tackled the guy because he didn't like his policies and didn't like the way that he voted. It was actually a neighbor that lives in the same neighborhood as Rand Paul, and severely injured him, wound up, I think, puncturing one of his lungs, if I'm not mistaken, did some serious damage to his respiratory system. And part of his lung was actually removed in 2019, so he may be somebody that is far more vulnerable to COVID-19 than the average person, and he is quarantining himself out of an abundance of caution, which is the right thing to do. And his colleagues are not exactly spring chickens. They're not exactly out of the danger zone when it comes to this thing either. Now, he has a special circumstance, but a lot of his senator colleagues, let's just be honest, they're old. They're a lot older than him. He's one of the youngest senators that currently sits in office, and so You got people like Richard Shelby, and I mean no disrespect to Senator Shelby, but I mean the guy's, what, in his 80s now? So he would be somebody that is considered at high risk for this thing being really bad for him. Doug Jones isn't a spring chicken either. He's younger than Shelby, but I mean, he's not exactly a young guy. And so our senators possibly could wind up with this thing. It wouldn't surprise me. Senator Mike Lee had direct contact with him and had direct contact with him when it was likely that he was carrying. So because of that, he is actually now quarantining himself too, and neither is going to be in session for the next few days, which is a big problem considering there's so much action going on in the Senate. If you've been keeping up with the national news, you'll know that just today, the Senate Democrats really actually wound up kind of blocking a massive spending stimulus bill, which for once I'm actually glad that the Democrats decided that they were going to vote against a massive spending bill, which seems a little odd and counterintuitive, but that's what happened. But anyway, as a result of that, you're going to have some senators not able to attend, like Mike Lee and a couple others that Rand Paul had contact with, and of course Rand Paul himself. And what is important about this is I think that this is a fantastic opportunity, and I'm not doing this in any way to be sarcastic. I think really we should consider this, to completely overhaul the way that we run Congress. And I don't mean overhaul the people or anything like that, even though I think that could use a good bit of overhauling as well. What I'm talking about specifically is the way that we conduct business. Because in Congress, it is a constant problem with senators and members of the House of Representatives not showing up for certain votes. They literally can't be at every vote because of some of the things that they have to do. We saw a video not long ago, well, it may have been a few months ago, that AOC actually got upset at one of her Republican colleagues that called for a postponement of a particular measure that was sort of one of her pet projects. And he was like, well, I'm on two committees at the same time and I can't be in two places at once, which is the reason that I called for us to adjourn for the day. And so this is something that is a constant problem for members of the House and the Senate. And I think we need to really reconsider having them be able to remote in for different meetings. Now, in that particular circumstance that I just gave, that example, I'm not sure how much that would help because you wouldn't really be able to listen to two different committee hearings at the same time. I was just using that to illustrate the amount of things they have to juggle and keep in the air at one time. And I think the ability to remote into sessions might actually be something that is really helpful. Our founders were fervent advocates for the ability to essentially live in your own district and primarily be with the people there and live amongst them. That's the reason that a lot of people don't realize this. When the Constitution was first signed and ratified and our first federal government came together with our first Congress, our first Senate, our first House, all of that, they only met for about a month. And then they went home. 11 months out of the year, they didn't really have any need to set foot in Washington unless there was some kind of big emergency. And that's the way that it was for decades. Only recently has being a senator or a House of Representative member become a full-time job. I mean, relatively recent in our history. I know that it wasn't like 2 years ago, but I'm just saying recent considering the entire 200-plus year history of our country. That's a relatively new development, the idea that it's something that happens 12 months out of the year. So what I'm proposing is that one thing that would help move us not quite as far back as I would like to back when Congress really only met for about a month out of the year, but what would move us closer to the vision that our founders originally intended is to have the people live by their own rules and live amongst the people that they have gone to D.C. to represent by largely living in their own districts, in their own precincts, as it were, and living by the rules that they themselves enact. I think that it would definitely not solve all our problems, but would be a big step in helping us get legislators that actually understand us and live amongst us pretty much all the time. And it does a lot to get rid of the bubble, as it were, because let's be honest, an awful lot of people in DC live in a bubble. And they live in a bubble in the sense that they are so high up in the ivory tower that they don't have a lot of interaction with your average everyday American. And I'm not saying that this would solve that problem entirely, but I think it would go a long way in keeping the senators and congressmen a little bit more grounded in the place that they have been elected from and talking to their constituents on a more daily basis. Access would definitely be a lot better. And I think the ability to have them just remote in the vast majority of the time would be significantly better in a number of ways. First of all, I mean, technology has made it significantly easier to do something like this. Look at me right now. I mean, you're watching this from a home studio that I set up in my apartment. And I know it's not perfect and it doesn't exactly look like prime time on CNN or Fox News. But I have a really nice background. I have a professional quality microphone. I've got a webcam that cost me under $100 that's able to shoot high def film. I've got a computer setup that does all this. I mean, I did all this on a very modest budget. Surely our senators and congressmen would be able to do something similar and to be able to just remote in for any media appearances or to be able to remote in for their votes, their discussions, to be able to discuss things on the floor. And it would go a really long way in keeping them closer to the people that they're supposed to represent. The Senate specifically, but especially the House, which is supposed to be the people's house. And so I think that this is a good way to look at that and say, well, since we have the technology to do this, maybe we should restructure things like this. So if something like an emergency, like this virus pops up to where a lot of people have to quarantine, or for whatever reason, DC is in danger for some reason, this would be a way that it would be a lot more secure, for one. For example, you may remember that and of course this is a movie, but it's something that theoretically could happen if our security measures failed, how in the Man of Steel movie, the DC movie, that Lex Luthor actually planted a bomb inside a committee hearing in Congress and wound up killing an awful bunch of legislatures. Well, that would be a lot harder to do if they're all remoted in. If you had, 400 plus members of the House of Representatives scattered all over the country in their different districts where their offices are located, do you have any idea how hard it would be to seriously cripple the United States lawmaking abilities when they're all spread out like that? I mean, that would be almost impossible to do. And so I think that this would really, really help when it comes to security with things like that. Senators Rand Paul and Mike Lee could argue and vote from their homes or from their offices with a setup studio just like the one that I have, or even less high tech than that. And it would also save us an awful lot of money. That's another thing I think a lot of people should consider. Because there's no telling how much money is spent for senators and congressmen having to travel around and go back and forth from their district to the Senate and the House themselves in D.C., going back and forth. It would save a lot of money there. It would also save an awful lot of their expenses when it comes to things like eating out, because we know that that's something that costs an awful lot of money for them. But D.C. is one of the most expensive places. In fact, the 10 richest areas in the world surround D.C. The 10 richest counties in the United States, which means the richest place in the world, is D.C. And if you've ever been to D.C., you know this. I mean, it's insanely expensive to just go and have a meal with your family when you're in D.C. And so because of this, I think that you would wind up saving a lot of money just by relocating them to the places where they're from. I mean, the heartland is obviously going to be a lot cheaper than your areas like D.C. And another thing, too, and I don't know if this is necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. I know that it certainly hurts my industry to a certain degree, but it would also help some of the local media, because it would be nice to have Senator Shelby and Senator Jones a little closer to home, or, Gary Palmer or Mo Brooks, or even though I'm sure that she would still not do any media appearances, even no matter where she was, Martha Roby, having her nearby. When you think about that, it would actually make the national media, it would make them have to expend a little bit more, not much more, because I mean, if you could remote them in, it wouldn't matter anyway. In fact, that might actually be cheaper in some circumstances, depending on whatever is surrounding it. But it would also be significantly more expensive for lobbyists to operate. So instead of a lobbyist meeting with several lawmakers at once, they would either have to do so digitally, or they would have to go to the individual places where they are. And if it happened digitally, presumably there would be a record of that. It wouldn't necessarily be available to the public, but it could be. And so there's just all kinds of advantages to at least having a system in place. I'm not saying that we should make it to where they're not even allowed to show up in the United States House of Representatives or in the Senate building, but I'm saying having this infrastructure in place ahead of time would solve an awful lot of headaches on a day-to-day basis, and it would make it super easy for an emergency situation like this where they may have to remote in to record votes. And it would also help them actually conduct business in a way where they don't have to all gather at one specific spot. So it might actually make them a little more efficient in decision making. I personally kind of hope that doesn't happen, but the point is that would be something that would be an advantage. And a lot of these senators and congressmen that can't be in for every single vote physically in the building, it would make it easier for them as well. But ultimately, I would ask that you pray for Rand Paul, pray for his family, and that if he does wind up, experiencing symptoms and getting this thing, that because he's at a high risk factor, that nothing bad would happen to him. But as a more general rule, pray for our Congress in general right now. Not just for their health, because I think we need to do that as well, but also that they would make wise decisions right now. If you've noticed in the national news, they're caught up in gridlock right now, which I actually think, based on the proposal so far, is probably a good thing. But at the same time, I think that they are under a lot of stress and a lot of pressure. And unfortunately, there's an awful lot of people that are playing politics and trying to get one up on the other side and use this crisis as a way to do it. And so because there's a lot of that going on, please pray for our Congress. Pray for the ones that are doing stuff like that to stop. And pray for the ones that are actually trying to do the right thing to not be drawn in by that. There's a myriad of things to pray for right now. So before we move on and before we do a commercial break, which we're going to jump to in just a second, I have been trying to do a little bit more entertainment news, and there's actually some big news on that front, which I'm going to try to get to a little bit later this week, if possible. If not, I'm not sure. But we're going to at least test out a few things to try to get you more content, since I know a lot of you have a lot more free time than you normally do. You're probably working from home, so we're trying to generate more content than normal for you on account of this. And because of that, I'd also like to do a little bit more casual stuff right now. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up is, I know a lot of you out there have to kill a lot of time. And one of the things that I really like to do with that is video games. So I'm going to throw out a few recommendations. If you're a retro video gamer, one of the things that I just played, and by the way, feel free if you're playing something or something has been particularly helpful to you dealing with self-quarantining and all of that, feel free to mention that in the comment section. But one of the things that I went through recently was Final Fantasy VIII. I just finished that one again. They have a brand new remake of it available on Switch and on Steam. And I decided I'd go ahead and play through it. And I will say this, Final Fantasy VIII is one of my favorite games of all time. But going through it again, it did help me remember and to realize that some of the mechanics in that game are just questionable at best and really odd at worst. And even though I think that it's got the best story in all of Final Fantasy history, I think that there are a few things that it does lack. And even on the story, as much as I love the story, one thing that is kind of unfortunate is that Ultimecia is just kind of a very bland, generic, evil bad guy without a whole lot of backstory or explanation as to who she actually is. And I do find that a little unfortunate, but I mean, the draw system and the goofy mechanics, it does draw away from it, but overall, that is by far the best version of Final Fantasy VIII that you're ever going to find. I mean, the retailored graphics look phenomenal. The characters, you can actually see a lot of detail even during gameplay, not just in the cutscenes. And I really do love certain parts of the battle system. I love the gunblade mechanics, some of the limit breaks, even though I disagree with, I don't really like the way that they come about. I do like the execution, Zell's dual abilities, the Rindozuken. I really, really like some of those abilities. And so if you haven't gone through some of the classic Final Fantasies in a while, they have all of the remakes and remasters available right now, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So definitely pick some of those up if you are in a nostalgic kind of mood. Another one that I've been playing recently, and this is to help me cope with my loss of baseball. Not only did the college baseball season end, but the major leagues have announced that across all spectrums, in other words, major and minor league, that all baseball is going to be put on hold for right now. They are suspending the season, which is, I really do hate it. I understand why they're doing it. In fact, if I were the commissioner of baseball, I would have made exactly the same call. But it is disappointing that we don't have baseball. And so as a means to cope with it, I've just been playing MLB The Show. And MLB The Show 20 just recently came out. So you've got a brand new Major League Baseball game available for the PS4 that you can be playing. And you guys have seen me play in some of the tournaments with the Sports Radio 740 Game Room. The game's a lot of fun, and it does give you, it's kind of like the nicotine gum to a smoker. And I hate to equate baseball to a bad thing like smoking or some other kind of vice like, I don't know, drinking or drug use or something. But, the show doesn't really do it for you the way that real live baseball does, but it takes the edge off a little bit, and I don't miss it quite as much because I'm getting to play as my beloved Braves and go through a season for the major leagues pretending that I'm watching real baseball. Now, the Braves probably aren't performing as well as they should considering I'm the one controlling them, but I'm not doing real well in MLB The Show. I do better at it than most sports games, but I don't know. I still have some issues with pitching. Some pitchers I can control real well based on their style, and some I just have a real hard time with. But anyway, I say all that to say, if you're a sports fan, you're a baseball fan, maybe pick up the new MLB The Show 20, and that'll help you with your baseball craving. And another thing that I've done, and this is one that's really interesting, since a lot of us are experiencing a lot of social isolation right now, one thing that can really help with that is life simulation games. Because you're in a simulated environment where you are having conversations with, granted, imaginary people, NPCs, but it still somewhat simulates a social interaction. And so because of that, one thing that I've recently picked up is there has been a new Animal Crossing that came out recently for the Nintendo Switch, Animal Crossing New Horizons. And it's by far the prettiest Animal Crossing game that there's ever been. The characters are very smooth. They're not as blocky as they used to be. And I've played not every Animal Crossing, but I've played most of them. And there are a few mechanics that I'm kind of iffy on right now, but overall, I'm only 2 days in. But overall, it does seem pretty good, and I do kind of like the fact that it makes you earn some things that some of the old Animal Crossings didn't. There's a little bit of a accomplishment feeling for some of the things that you didn't really have to work for, and you just kind of got basically for nothing out of the original Animal Crossing. This one you have to work for a little more. You've got to be a little more conscious of your resources. And I do like that mechanic about it. And so if you haven't picked up an Animal Crossing game in a while, and by the way, I'm one that actually quit the series because I thought each new Animal Crossing game was a little too similar to the old one. This one actually has a fair bit of difference, and the crafting system is something that's brand new and kind of fun to play around with. So if you haven't picked up an Animal Crossing game in a while like me, might be worth looking into, especially if you've got some friends that are interested that can play along, which I'm fortunate enough to have. I've got a few other buddies that picked it up as well. So that's just a recommendation on that part. So definitely have fun with that. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a minute on Tactics.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible, the only Bible read by Pete Buttigieg. Today's reading is going to come from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verses 30 through 38. And it says, Jesus replied and said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers, who were probably only stealing because the capitalist system had trapped them in a life of poverty. And they stripped him and beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. And by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, who was on a journey, came upon him. And when he saw him, he felt socially conscious outrage, and came to him and went on a passionate social media rant about how wrong it was that the priest and the Levite had ignored him, and how it proves that traditional organized religion doesn't work. When the man asked him for help, the Samaritan explained how the Jews had been systematically oppressing the Samaritans for centuries, and that he didn't need his help because of his Jew privilege. But despite this, the Samaritan assured him he would be the bigger man and contact his senator in Rome and start a new government program to help victims of roadside robberies and fund it by raising taxes on the 1%. Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? And he said, the one who taught him to be woke and fought the system with redistribution of wealth instead of just helping that one guy. Then Jesus said to him, go and do the same, comrade. Wow. So inspiring. This has been a reading from the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
And welcome back, everybody. Just got a notification that State Representative Arnold Mooney is actually watching now, so that's pretty cool. Welcome to the program, Representative Mooney. And I did want to talk about some national news as well. So the media, and granted, I know that I'm not breaking any stories here that you probably haven't already heard, but there's a new twist to this one that I wanted to bring up. So Trump is saying that the media is now saying that Trump's saying the Chinese virus is racist. I've already talked about this somewhat, but there is a new tweet out by AOC that I thought was pretty comical in relation to all this, because AOC is now saying also that Trump is racist for calling it the Chinese virus, which one thing that I wanted to bring up on this, I'll just bring this graphic up really quick. Just so you understand the context, this is the tweet that she was responding to, where it's a New York Times article talking about different Asian Americans that have been yelled at or attacked. And by attacked, they mean spit upon, which is still assault. I'm not trying to downgrade that at all, but I mean, it's not like people are just beating up Chinese people in the streets. But this person tweeted out this article saying, the predictable consequences of the president's rhetoric, it's rage-inducing. And then, of course, AOC responded with her own tweet with this, saying, yes, many who've never had to deal with the consequences of such rhetoric think objecting to the president's racism is about political correctness. Really, it's about protecting the millions of people who've become more vulnerable to hate crimes as a result of such language. So that's AOC's hot take on this. And one of the things that's just so incredibly ridiculous about this whole thing, first of all, I don't think that AOC understands her own woke vernacular here, because Chinese is not a race. There is no such race as the Chinese. Chinese is a nationality. Now, the vast majority of Chinese, not all, but the vast majority of Chinese are Asian people. But so are Filipinos and Koreans and Japanese. Like, those people are all Asian as well. Actually, Indian. We don't usually think of them as quote-unquote Asian, but they're Asian as well. They're a little bit genetically different, but ultimately they're Asians as well. And so, first of all, she gets even the very words there wrong. Chinese is not a race. And so when President Trump calls the virus the Chinese virus, well, that can't be a racist statement, because it's not a race of people. It's a nationality. It could be nationalist maybe, but it's not racist. But the more ridiculous claim, of course, here, even if you ignore the vocabulary error that AOC makes there is that she is essentially faulting President Trump for random idiots doing stupid things. Now, ultimately, when it comes to the rhetoric, I actually think that it's important that we do remember that this thing not only came from China, but was caused by the Chinese government. Not the Chinese people, the Chinese government. And when it comes down to this, a bunch of random people attacking the Chinese doesn't even make sense, like I said, because, first of all, Chinese isn't a race anyway. And if they were attacking those people, well, those people had nothing to do with the cover-up. And another thing that's really odd, too, if the people that are attacking the Chinese people, the immigrants, or whether they're here on visas or whatever reason that they're in the United States for, that doesn't really make a lot of sense either. Like, if you're worried about the coronavirus, or you assume that just because somebody is Chinese that they have coronavirus, attacking them is one of the dumbest things you can do, because I don't know if these people have never hurt anyone before or been in a fight or something, but the point of the typically is to harm the other person. And normally what happens when that takes place is if you are successful in that, then they start bleeding. And the exchange of bodily fluids is the easiest way for the coronavirus. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. Maybe there are some people that are really scared of the coronavirus and have attacked Asian Americans because of that. But if they have, then it's one of the dumbest things that you can do, because then you would get their bodily fluids on you, presumably, if you were successful in doing so, which would cause you to then contract coronavirus. It doesn't make any sense. Maybe they've done that. I don't know. There's a lot of stupid people out there. But it doesn't even follow the normal rules of logic. And what I also don't understand about this with AOC is apparently these random morons that are attacking, regular people of Chinese descent or Asian Americans that look Chinese, however they're deciding this. I'm guessing that if they're racist, they're not real picky about it. She's blaming President Trump for that. But when they cited these different things, and in fact, when a reporter was talking to President Trump the other day saying, she's like, there have been about a dozen. Okay, a dozen incidents is bad. Definitely not a good thing. But a dozen incidents in a nation of 327 million? That's really not, some kind of massive groundswell of anti-Chinese nationalism or racism. That's just not, that's not indicative of a large movement. And second of all, do you really think that President Trump calling it the Chinese virus is the reason behind that? Because that doesn't make any sense either. Because the media and Town Hall actually put together a fantastic supercut of all this, different personalities in the media, everywhere from HuffPo to the Young Turks to CNN to MSNBC, referring to this thing as the Chinese virus or the Wuhan flu or whatever you want to call it. The Kung flu is personally my favorite term for it, but they were calling it that beforehand, and it was not racist. And if you want another double standard from AOC specifically, apparently these random idiots that have no presumable association with President Trump, maybe they were Trump voters, maybe not, we don't know. Those guys are responsible for these random but minor acts of violence or assault against these Chinese immigrants, some of them so minor that they're just being yelled at, which again, not cool, not okay to do, but still not assault. President Trump is responsible for that. But Bernie Sanders is not responsible for one of his campaign workers, somebody that was on Bernie Sanders' payroll for his campaign, trying to assassinate about 10% of Congress because they were Republicans. You remember that at the softball game where the gunman opened fire and nearly killed Majority Whip Steve Scalise? That wasn't Bernie Sanders' fault. And you'll remember the day of, if you were listening to my program, I said on the air, that's not Bernie Sanders' fault. Well, I said that the day we found it out, not the day that it actually happened. But the day we found out that guy was a former Bernie Sanders campaign worker, I said, look, as much as I dislike Bernie Sanders, he is not to blame for this. The guy is to blame for this. So apparently it's not Bernie Sanders' fault when that happens, even though there was someone with a direct connection to him. But when these random idiots do so, somehow it's President Trump's fault, despite the fact that he has no presumable connection with them at all. And even if they did, still wouldn't be Trump's fault. It's the fault of the person, not the fault of Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump or anybody, unless they're directly calling for acts of violence, which of course President Trump is not. Furthermore, it's not uncommon at all to refer to viruses by their point of origin. There's a few examples here, just a few. Spanish influenza, Zika virus, which is named after the Zika forest of Uganda, West Nile virus, Ebola, which, by the way, translates Black River in the original language. That's the reason that it's called Ebola, is because it came from the Black River there in Africa. The Ross River virus of Australia, Black Typhus River from Bolivia, that's where we get typhoid fever and typhus. Marburg virus from Marburg, Germany. That's another one. The Coxsackie, I believe I'm saying that right. Coxsackie virus from Coxsackie, New York. And another one that happened just recently, MERS. A lot of people don't realize this, but MERS stands for Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. So is calling the MERS virus, which is actually a cousin of the coronavirus, is calling it MERS racist because it happens to come from the Middle East? Well, no, and this isn't that either. It's very common for viruses to be named after their point of origin. In fact, that's probably the most common way to call it that. There are a few others, like malaria, for example. That one comes from an ancient language where malaria means bad air. So, yeah, that one's a little different. But as far as naming viruses or naming illnesses after the place where they come from, that's a pretty common practice. And even the media didn't think it was racist to refer to it as the Wuhan or the Chinese virus right up until the point Republicans started doing that. And then all of a sudden it was racist because to them, it's more important to score political points. And what is amazing to me with all this is in the middle of what the media, correctly in my estimation, deems a worldwide pandemic and an emergency situation, they really want to have this argument at a time where they're complaining about how divisive Republicans are and how divisive our rhetoric is. They're really going to try to drive a wedge between people on account of this? They're really trying to score political points and make Trump seem as though he's a racist when all this is going on. Do we not have better things to worry about at the time? And let's also remember that basically what the media has been doing by doing this is carrying China's water, because their narrative, and you'll have to see them translated obviously, but you can look at Chinese reports on the news because they control all the media within the borders of China, actually claiming that the United States is responsible for this, saying that the U.S. military, U.S. soldiers planted this as some kind of response to or a reaction to China not backing down on things like tariffs. And I'm no fan of tariffs. But seriously, this is going to be a reaction to this, that China is going to claim that America did it? There was a lady that was actually a guest on CNN, and the day before she appeared on CNN was on Chinese media talking about how the fact that America was already developing a vaccine was proof that they had the virus for a lot longer and that they were the ones that actually created this thing as some kind of biological weapon. Which, of course, is utter nonsense, but the fact that CNN invited her on and took her seriously in this shows where their loyalties really do lie. Everybody from the Huffington Post to the Washington Post, which is a slightly more moderate media outlet, has been labeling the president racist because of this. The New York Times even tried to give China credit in saying that they bought us time. No, the Chinese, we found out from reports internally with their own whistleblowers, knew about this and knew that it was contagious about a month before they told other people. They even lied to the World Health Organization, said that they had conducted an investigation and found that it could not be transferred from human to human, and the World Health Organization just believed them. They've been lying to us from the very start. Originally, they lied that the thing even existed and had the doctor that discovered it, who now has died. They told him that he had to sign a letter saying that he basically made it all up and that it wasn't real. And then they quarantined him for getting the coronavirus, even though they had a test that had shown to be unreliable and only gave the correct result 1 out of every 6 times. And then after he tested negative for it several times, he died because of the coronavirus, or a bullet to the head. I'm not really sure which, but either one is very plausible in his story. And even after all of that happened, they still hid it and covered it up and told the World Health Organization it cannot be transferred from human to human. That it was basically a niche thing, it was a one-time thing, and there were not humans transferring it to other people. And they also kept all of their borders open because, well, there's no virus, there's nothing to worry about here. Why would we close our borders? To save face, because this is what communist big governments do. They put the health of their own people and the entire world and the economy at risk because they were basically hoping that it would all blow over and nobody would find out that it was their own problem, and that is where the virus originally came from. So by the media trying to hide the fact and disguise the fact that this thing did come from Wuhan, China, they've been carrying their water. And why did it come from Wuhan, China? Well, there's a lot of different theories on that, and we probably don't know for sure yet. But a lot of people do draw it back to some of the exotic choices in the Wuhan market, which, by the way, is a black market operation that the Chinese government has been trying to shut down for years, but has been unsuccessful in doing so. The reason we don't have people in America buying literal rats as food is because, well, we have a system where you don't have to because there are better options available through capitalism. It was a big government that is unable to keep its citizens from eating actual rodents and vermin because that's the only thing they have available to them under communism. But somehow we're supposed to just ignore the fact that China is responsible for all of this and then was also responsible for hiding it, covering up, letting people come in and out of their borders without any kind of checks or anything. And now we're paying the price for it and had been responsible for it, and now we're trying to lie and say that the United States is actually the one that caused it. Well, no. If you have all that, then President Trump is right to continuously, every time he talks about it, point out the fact that this did in fact come from China. And it's important for us to do the same. Let's go to the daily dose of stupid.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
Now, for today's daily dose of stupid, the left is not only attacking Trump for referring to this virus which came from Wuhan, China as the Wuhan Chinese coronavirus. Not only are they attacking him for that, but they've also been attacking him today for wanting to end the quarantine. So this is what Trump tweeted out, and I know when somebody types in all caps on the show, it's kind of a show tradition that I shout into the microphone, but the whole thing is in caps, and frankly, I just don't have the voice for that right now. So I'm going to just read this in my normal Trump impersonation voice. So this was what the president tweeted earlier today. If I can get it to pull up there. Oh, there we go. We cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself. At the end of the 15-day period, we will make a decision as to which way we want to go. So, President Trump there, and by the way, just before I get into the meat and potatoes of this, old people, please quit typing things in all caps. Nobody wants to listen. Like, no one wants to read that. I'm doing this because I get paid to read his tweets, and it's my job to report on the news. But when anybody under the age of about 45 sees a tweet that's in all caps, they're not going to take you seriously. And frankly, this makes it lose some of its effectiveness, even though I agree with what he's saying, because he's typing in all caps. I don't know why, but it seems like if you're over the age of about 40, they just want to type in all caps all the time. I don't know why. I guess it's a generational thing. I don't know. Anyway, so that was the tweet that he put out. And immediately the media started losing it over it. Here's just a handful of the headlines. This just happened today, so these are just the articles responding to this today. You can see there from Mike.com, with coronavirus, Trump appears torn between saving lives or the economy. New York Magazine, Trump already losing patience with being semi-responsible on coronavirus. CNN, Trump is itching to scale back social distancing after 15 days, just itching for it, CNN says. And then The Guardian, Trump signals change in coronavirus strategy that could clash with health experts. So you see, they're all very much trying to cast this as a horrible thing, that President Trump is being irresponsible in his response to coronavirus, and he's putting profits and the economy ahead of the well-being of people. So there's a couple things I want to address here first, right out of the gate. First of all, I will be the first to say that President Trump and the White House's response to this was lackluster. They did not want it to happen, and because of that, they acted like it wasn't happening. It was basically the policy of wishful thinking, which is a really, really bad idea, really when you're dealing with pretty much any problem, but especially when you're dealing with what could be a very serious global pandemic. So I understand the criticism there, and I was one of the people being critical of him when that took place. I implored the president, please take this thing seriously. And for a while, they didn't. But now that they actually have, and he's saying, okay, well, we're thinking about after 15 days, maybe we start backing off on that. Immediately the left goes, oh, Trump's irresponsible. He's just going to go ahead and pull this thing because he cares more about the economy. He cares more about getting reelected, and he knows that that's going to hurt him. And so what he's doing there is he's just putting himself above that, which, first of all, with Trump's ego, frankly, I could kind of see that. So I'm not saying that the logic wouldn't be there in certain other circumstances, but the reason it's not fair to criticize him for this on this particular situation is because he didn't say we're going to limit it to 15 days and then back off. What he said was, we'll see where we are in 15 days. I don't understand why this is an unreasonable or irrational position to take, to say, well, let's see where we are, and if it's not that bad, if it's not a problem, maybe let's back off a little bit. I don't see how anybody can get upset with that if this were the same thing and President Obama were still in office. I would look at that and say, well, all right, we'll see where it goes. I mean, I don't want to be quarantined anymore either. And I love how they're chastising him for wanting the thing to end. Everybody wants it to end. Every person wants it to end, and the sooner it can end and also be safe, then the better. And as much as I have my differences with President Trump, and as much as I did have my differences with President Obama, if he said exactly the same thing, I would not believe that President Obama, because it would hurt him politically, so if nothing else, he would have a self-interest in doing this, just like President Trump does now, in not calling off the quarantine before he believed that it was safe. And both presidents in this situation would have a wealth of informed, intelligent people around them with a lot more credentials on dealing with stuff like this than they do, talking to them about when it's safe and when it's okay and when it would be permissible to do that. President Trump's desire to get the economy back up and running as soon as possible is a good thing. I don't want him to jump the gun. I don't want him to do so before everybody gives the all clear. But at the same time, the fact that he's saying, yeah, we need to get this thing rolling as soon as we possibly can, that's a positive. Because if we don't, it could very well have ramifications that could last years, maybe even a decade or more, if we don't make sure that our economy is still rolling when all this thing is over and the smoke clears and we start emerging from our corona caves. And so I do not get the people on the left chastising him for a wait-and-see mentality. That just doesn't make any sense to me. But as always, the media overplays their hand. They had a very real opportunity, and I think it was justified, to call the Trump administration out on not taking it seriously, basically governing from the standpoint of wishful thinking. That is a legitimate criticism, and you're going to see Joe Biden running some political ads kind of along those lines. And politically, that's what should happen, because that was a legitimate complaint from the left. But complaining about him and saying, we'll see where we are in 15 days, and if it's at all possible and safe for everybody to start the economy back up, yeah, let's do that. That's not something to get mad about. And so once again, the left could have won this political battle easily by just criticizing the president where he is worthy of criticism And going no further than that, but they can't help themselves. It's like a sickness with them. That's why we call it Trump derangement syndrome. That they have, everything that he's ever done is always the worst. It's always horrible. It's always bad. And they can't at any point just lay off and let the president, dig his own hole. I don't know what it is with the media, but they just cannot seem to do that. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Our chaplain's report today, it comes from the book of Judges. Now, one thing that you need to know about Gideon, and I will give you a little bit of backstory just to help all of you understand this. I'm not going to go into the details. You can find his story a few chapters before the reading that we're going to do today, but suffice it to say that Gideon, or as he's called in this particular chapter, Jerubbaal. I know, it's a weird name, but that's what his name is. He has a couple names, just like a lot of Bible characters. He was one of Israel's objectively best judges. He did an awful lot of the things that he was supposed to do. He cast down the altars of foreign gods. He drove out the enemies of Israel when Israel had refused to do so themselves. I mean, by any measure, he's one of the better judges that Israel experienced in their time being under judgeship before the time of kings came a little bit later. But he had two major flaws, and they wound up in a lot of ways undoing a lot of the good that he had done. First of all, he messed around with too many women. And I understand the temptation there. That's something that can get a lot of men in trouble. But he had several wives, and because he had so many wives, he had a lot of sons, 70 in fact. So he is obviously with a lot of women, some he was married to, some that were just concubines. But the point is, he's with a lot of women, and that's a bad idea. We can understand this through Jesus actually explaining the same concept in Matthew 19, going all the way back to Genesis. God's design was always a man and a woman together for life, period. There is nothing else that fits God's definition of marriage. And it's amazing to me that when you look through the Old Testament, there are a lot of people that have multiple partners, multiple wives. And every single time, I can't think of an exception to this. Maybe there are some that some other biblical scholars could point out that I can't, but for sure the majority of the time, and with every major Bible character that is reported to have multiple wives, it always ends badly. That's something that I do find very astounding. And the other major flaw is pride. Because we read right before Gideon's death that he had created an ephod for himself. And what an ephod is it is a breastplate that was supposed to be worn only by the priest. Now, Gideon was a good judge, but he was not a Levite and he was not a priest. He was not somebody that was permitted, according to the law of Moses, to wear an ephod. And because he had seen himself as somebody who had God's favor and was doing God's work, which were both good things, he took it upon himself to take on a role that God had not allowed him to do. Gideon had so many good things going for him, and he had done so much in the name of the Lord. But at the tail end, he allowed his pride to overtake him. He thought that because he had done so many good things for God, that basically God would let him get away with things and that he would put himself in a position that the Lord had not ordained him to. And unfortunately, there's an awful lot of people that get in trouble with that even today. For example, a lot of women that I believe are sincere and good try to take on roles that God has not given to them in the worship service. Not to say they're not talented, like I'm sure Gideon was. Not to say that they're not sincere, like I'm sure Gideon was. He still was not somebody that was permitted to take on the ephod and act as though he was a Levite. That was not a role that God had approved for him. But we see in Judges 9, 5 through 6 that these two errors wound up costing not only him, but the generation after him. And it says there in Judges 9, verses 5 through 6, then went to his father's house at Ophrah. By the way, this is talking about Gideon's son. Then he went to his father's house at Ophrah and killed his brothers and the sons of Jerubbaal, which is also Gideon, 70 men on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. All the men of Shechem and all of Bethmelo assembled together, and they went and made Abimelech king by the oak of the pillar which was in Shechem. So Abimelech, the son of Gideon, went and killed all of his brothers except for one. There was only one that escaped. 70 men who were his own flesh and blood did he murder because he wanted his father's prestige and power. By any measure, Gideon was a very good man, but these two flaws were unfortunately things he passed down to his son. And I think that there are a few lessons to be learned from this. First of all, even if you're pretty good, your sins are still going to find you out. There's a lot of people that live good, godly lives, but just like every other person, they're imperfect. And just like every other sin, whether it comes from a pretty good person or an absolutely wretched, despicable person, their sins have consequences. And those consequences hurt not only them, but other people around them. You see, Gideon's sins destroyed his entire family, wiped him out, except for two, his youngest son and his oldest evil son. And Abimelech, his oldest son, did this, and I think that that really shows that, first of all, your parents can't make you a good person. This is something that is shown over and over again throughout the Old Testament. I mean, you could look everywhere from Cain and Abel. You could look at Jacob and Esau, how one son turned out really good and one son really kind of didn't. You could also look through this story. You could look through all the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel. Some of the kings of Judah were really good people, didn't make their children good. There were a lot of really evil kings that were the descendants of Jacob. Well, all of them were the descendants of Jacob. They were the descendants of David and Solomon. And yet they were pretty evil people. And so that should be a warning that your parents cannot make you good, even when your parents do a good job. And I think that Gideon's job was pretty good, but definitely left some room for improvement, especially considering the way that he was with women. This is something that really comes back to hurt him and his family later after he's gone. And that's because ultimately, even if you do raise your kids right, sometimes they just make evil decisions because they are free moral agents as well. Another thing that's important to note here is that polygamy really never works out well with or without marriage. Whether you're talking about in Gideon's situation where there's a whole bunch of people that he slept with, or whether you're talking about something that would be a little bit more modern where you're not necessarily married to a lot of the people, but you sleep around before you find the one that you want to settle down with. That's something that no matter how you slice it, no matter what circumstance surrounds it, it's never a good idea and it never works out well for the people involved. I mean, I could go through all the statistics about how people that sleep around before marriage are less likely to be sexually satisfied in their marriage. They're more likely to get divorced. I mean, there's a laundry list of side effects that come with that. But ultimately, what it boils down to is doing something that is against our nature is not good. And who would know our nature better than the one who actually created us, the one who designed our nature? God didn't tell us this because he wanted it to be a killjoy or he wanted to keep us from having a good time. He did this because he understood it was the right way to live, the one that benefited us the most. That having one partner for all of our lives was the only way to find what he was hoping for us to get out of a marriage. And that doesn't mean that everybody that doesn't do that is doomed to a lifetime of horrible relationships and marriages, but it definitely does not set the table in a good way. And it means that there are going to be some hurdles and some difficulties that arrive in your marriage that don't necessarily have to be there if you just follow God's plan. And this situation just wouldn't have happened if Gideon had done the right thing and stayed with one woman his entire life, because maybe Abimelech, somebody as heartless as Abimelech, might have wound up killing his siblings even if they came from the same mother and father. But the way that the text reads, it seems to suggest that Abimelech was the only son of his mother by Gideon, and all the others were from different women. And based on the way that he treats them, killing his half-brothers and sisters, that seems to be the case. Maybe he would have been more reticent if the only brothers and sisters that he had were also his mother's children. I don't know that for sure, but it seems more likely. It at least seems plausible. And finally, and this is something that is a little terrifying, pride can be passed on to your children. Gideon had too much pride. Not enough to kill people to get the prestige or the position that he wanted, but enough to raise himself up into a position that he wasn't supposed to have. And unfortunately, that's a trait that Abimelech learned from his father. You see, there wasn't supposed to be a king in Israel. They were supposed to have a judge system, but Abimelech was the son of the closest thing they had to a king. It was a very famous and very prosperous judge, and so he decided that he needed to be king. And because of that, he started setting stuff up to where he could be the king, and there were people that actually did consider him king. The verse points that out, that there were people that consider him a king in Israel. He didn't rule over all of Israel, and people didn't really recognize his kingship later on. But the point is, that was something that he tried to establish because he tried to, like his father, put himself in a position that God had not ordained him for, that God did not want him to hold. And at that point, wanted nobody to hold in the kingdom. And looking at all of that, I think that it should remind us not to underestimate our own influence. The things that we do, the choices that we make, they influence people around us in ways that we can't predict, in ways that we don't understand, and sometimes even the best influence doesn't end well. But if we're a bad influence, it's certainly not going to end well. And that's something that I think that all of us need to remember and to reconsider when we do things and make choices that affect the people around us. See, like I said, Gideon was a pretty good dude. But when it came right down to it, he was too arrogant, and he messed around with too many women, and that wound up costing him and the nation of Israel dearly. His family suffered a great deal because of those two things. And maybe Abimelech would have turned out to be a murderous, rotten person, even if Gideon had been perfect. We don't know. But if nothing else, he wouldn't have had the opportunity to do so, and his father's influence wouldn't have been the thing that drove him to that. That would have been something he got from somewhere else. So I know that this is kind of an odd lesson to do at a time where very few of us are having a lot of social interaction. But maybe this is even more important when we're quarantined in our households with our families, is to remember the impact of our choices on other people. Are we going to drive them further away from God? Or are we going to be a good influence and inspire them to draw closer to God? Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalrata Church of Christ.